Okay. Good afternoon. This is Brian Lance here. We're starting our meeting for Saturday, the 16th of March, here in Houston, Texas. I'm going to start by reviewing very briefly the exoneration campaign for Lyndon LaRouche, which we've launched. And I'm going to read some very brief excerpts from some of the eulogies that have poured in, letters and so forth, that have poured in from around the world. And I want you to just kind of let them roll over or roll through your mind, just to reflect on who Lyndon H. LaRouche was, and actually still is. His work is being magnified, and we'll get into that in the case of Italy at this very moment. The moves in Italy for joining the Belt and Road Initiative, signing a memorandum of understanding, which looks imminent. But I wanted to do this to start with the issue of Lyndon LaRouche himself, because I think for new people it's important to be introduced and give some sense of who he was and is, and why you should become active and join this movement. And so that's where I'm starting. And we launched the exoneration campaign for a couple of reasons. First of all, as we state on the website, and the letters and background of LaRouche is available on the LaRouche PAC website, on the Schiller Institute website, and elsewhere. And the petition is available across a range of social media as well, where you can sign it. But was specifically to ensure that his ideas were not buried by his enemies, or distorted by his enemies. And obviously, the best insurance of that is the broadest circulation of those rich, very rich, potent ideas in the world today and the world tomorrow. And secondly, because it's essential, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche emphasized, the president of the Schiller Institute, and of course the widow of Lyndon LaRouche, that we have to stop the trajectory towards war. Sam Nunn, former U.S. Senator, recently co-wrote an op-ed that appeared in Politico and elsewhere, asking the question of whether or not we were sleepwalking into war. And that's very, should be a very real concern to every American and every person on this planet. Not just because of something like Venezuela, which is bad enough, but the withdrawal from the INF Treaty, on top of the much earlier withdrawal under the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration from the ABM Treaty, the potential withdrawal from SALT and so forth, the potential of a new arms race, the increase of the, at least proposed increase in the U.S. defense budget, even further increase, the warnings from Russia, but also from scientists in the United States that we're clicking or ticking closer and closer to midnight. And at this point, there is no so-called anti-war movement out there in the streets. Quite the contrary. So it's important to draw attention to exactly those forces who attempted to destroy Lyndon LaRouche, that sent him to prison for 5 years. Actually, they attempted to put him there for life, but that didn't work out because better minds, better efforts prevailed. That the people the individuals and institutions involved in the targeting of LaRouche in the 1980s and 90s in particular, those are the same people attempting to bring down the Trump administration, and these are the very same forces attempting to bring on what would be World War III. You had just recently, roughly a week ago, a little more than a week ago, in Sea Island, Georgia, you had a meeting of the American Enterprise Institute with Dick Cheney joining people like Pompeo and Pence, Mike Pence, I imagine Bolton was there and so forth, with Cheney railing against Trump's independence, that Trump still attempts to build relations with Russia and China, that Trump is leading an independent effort to solve the crisis on the Korean Peninsula, which, as he has emphasized, was escalating otherwise towards conflict. So this attempt to reassert unilateralism, nominally U.S. unilateralism, but really unilateralism on behalf of the Anglo-American British-centered empire, oligarchical interest, against the rest of the world, whether in Venezuela or to disrupt the Korean negotiations or confront Russia ever closer to its borders, China likewise. These efforts at unilateralism and intervention are leading us right down the path towards war. So in laying bare Lynn's role and the alternative perspective for peace through economic development that he laid out over the course of his life, if you go to the first slide here, this is a picture of LaRouche in 2003 in India at a major conference there. To his left, as you look at the picture, is Mr. Singh, who had been the chairman of the non-aligned movement. To Mr. LaRouche's, or to our right, is Helga Zepp-LaRouche. This is 2003, so 16 years ago. But LaRouche was engaged in an international effort since at least the 1970s to foster a countervailing direction for the West in economics, politics, and culture. And I'm going to start by reading from the just a short, I'm reading very short excerpts. Some of you have already perhaps read them or heard them before, a few of them, so very briefly. My first one is from India. To me, Mr. LaRouche came across as an old-style American whose life mission was to get America back after the disruptions of the Second and Cold Wars to its founding anti-colonial constitutional roots. He had very little for the so-called new economy, which is virtually all that's left here today. We'll come back to that. Of making money by being middlemen in mere information circulation. In any case, he saw nothing in such mega enterprises that negated what he considered the political philosophy of the real American economy. Alexander Hamilton's report on manufacturers. Lyndon LaRouche, continuing a little bit later, he says, I mentioned his name to a visiting American businessman with a liberal social persuasion, who exclaimed, LaRouche is so far on the right, he's out on the left.
Whatever that means.
Ah, like Gandhi, you mean, said I. This is Dr. V. Siddhartha, Senior Associate at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, where this conference that you see here was held, emeritus scientist, Defense Research and Development Organization of India. Now just briefly to turn to a couple of Americans. May Mr. Lyndon LaRouche rest in peace. He gave his very best to mankind. You, as others, have lost a fine mentor, teacher, and very close friend. Sherwood Woody Goldberg, Colonel, retired, U.S. Army, Bronze Star, former Associate Professor, U.S. Military Academy, West Point. So sorry to hear the sad news today. My sympathies to you who loved and worked with him. But so angry to read the obits, the New York Times and so forth. You may have noticed the press went haywire the minute they learned that Mr. LaRouche had passed. They refused to cover him for many years, of course, until they thought he was gone. And this, he said, 3 times I saw him speak in person. The first was almost a life-changing event. He was magnificent. And this is Clark Johnson, NASA scientist, retired, Massachusetts. From Yemen, the country of Yemen. As we commiserate with you for the loss of your husband and your journey's companion, this is written to Mrs. LaRouche, we here in Yemen remember with gratitude Mr. Lyndon LaRouche's stances in support of our nation's just cause in the face of the barbaric aggression waged against our nation, and his eagerness to see our Yemen thrive in peace and security on the basis of LaRouche's keys of economic development and progress. Our solace is that the memory of Lyndon LaRouche will remain fragrant in our country through the beautiful impact he had on building the character a group of BRICS youth here. And this is Hisham Sharif, His Honorable Hisham Sharif, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Yemen in Sana'a, Yemen. BRICS, of course, is a reference to the Brazil, India, China, South Africa alliance of nations, of leading developing nations with which we have worked so closely. So that's from Yemen. And then elsewhere, dear Mrs. LaRouche, it was with big sorrow that I've learned the sad news about Mr. Lyndon H. LaRouche's passing away. Indeed, he was a brilliant economist, a partisan of global justice, and a valiant fighter against predatory behaviors of the global synarchy. I feel very happy and honored to have met Mr. LaRouche personally and listened to his insightful explication of European and global economic history. I was deeply impressed by his enthusiasm and sense of humor. Since then, his predictions about the U.S., the West, and the global economy have always been my favorite references. Alas, the world has lost a brilliant mind. And this is, again, only part of a longer statement, but this is from Ding Yifan, who is the Deputy Director of the Research Institute for World Development of the China Development Center, which is under the State Council, the equivalent of the cabinet of the China government. And then finally, one more. Why don't you move on to a few more of the slides while we're talking about this? Is I'll just come back to this quote in this final eulogy. This is 1975. This is LaRouche's first work, public international work on economic development, how the International Development Bank will work, IDB, 1975. It came at the time of his trip, following his trip to the Middle East, working on, this is in the context of the oil embargoes, the oil crisis. If you were around in the 70s, many of you probably weren't, but this was a time of crisis and a war in the Middle East, and LaRouche intervened directly into this to pose a international development bank to initiate large-scale transfer as the basis of a just new world economic order. Next, please. At the center of what LaRouche was proposing then was what became known as the OASIS plan for nuclear power desalinization. You see it there on the map with these the little atomic signals symbols. The upgrading of the Suez Canal, which of course has occurred since, waterway tunnels and so forth. The next one. And this was a cover of EIR reporting on that a little bit later on. This is a continuing effort to accomplish a Treaty of Westphalia, a new Treaty of Westphalia. Continue on. And Lynn's economic textbook, which came out in 1984. So you wish to learn about economics. Here is, this is from another part of the world. A great thinker of our time, Lyndon LaRouche, has left us. He was a titan of thought, a man of incredibly encyclopedic knowledge, great soul, and love for humanity. He will always remain in our memory as an ardent fighter for mankind's happy future based on implementing of the principles of physical economy, a realistic school of economic thought directed towards the creation of material benefits and the conditions for social economic development. I remember one of the leaders of the Brookings Institution urging me in a whisper not to have any contact with LaRouche so as not to spoil my reputation. For me, who had come to the USA to take part in a scientific forum on issues of developing democratic institutions in the post-Soviet region, this was shocking. From then on, I started closely reading LaRouche's publications and attending conferences he organized. And I must acknowledge that his presentations were often a ray of light in the kingdom of darkness and hypocrisy, which had seized the public mind of quote-unquote progressive mankind. And then a bit further on, and this gives you a sense, for new people in particular, a sense of the scope again. LaRouche enjoyed enormous respect among the expert community in many nations, in many countries around the world. I have had the opportunity to meet his supporters in India, Latin America, China, Africa, and of course in Europe and the CIS countries. I would hope for this international expert community, inspired by the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, to be preserved. Today, those ideas are coming to life in a new world economic paradigm, which we call integral, for it unites the interests of the peoples of various countries in the harmonious development of humanity. And this is written by Sergei Glaziev, academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences and advisor to the president of the Russian Federation, President Vladimir Putin, from Moscow. So that's some sense. Let's move on with a few more slides here just to try to encompass. This is from 1979. The Science Foundation that LaRouche co-founded released a report, The Industrialization of Africa, which is now, of course, being taken up by the Belt and Road of China, but also with India and Japan and other countries coming in to collaborate with African nations. Move on to the next. Here is the report done through the EIR magazine, which was founded and for which LaRouche was the editor, chief editor. The Industrialization of India. This in the context of the growing work between Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche and Indira Gandhi and family. Move on to the next. This from the late 70s, 78, 79. This was the first pamphlet, national pamphlet put out by LaRouche on the science behind beam weapons, the development of beam weapons, and going to the science that would make it possible. Go on to the next. Of course, this became the Strategic Defense Initiative announced by President Ronald Reagan on March 23rd, 1983. We're coming up on the anniversary of that event next Saturday. Move on to the next. And this was a book published at the direction of Mr. LaRouche on beam defense, an alternative to nuclear destruction. Contrary to many of the stories, Reagan's effort and LaRouche's effort along with Dr. Edward Teller, was to jointly develop such defensive systems with Russia and other nations to make nuclear weapons obsolete and utilize the breakthroughs in the process of developing plasma technologies, insights into the so-called fourth state of matter, the development of the kind of equipment and technology. This would represent a new, a new Manhattan project, a new project, a new moonshot project, equivalent to what Kennedy had launched in the 1960s. Continue on to the next. And here is the 50-year development plan for the Indian Pacific Oceans Basin, which is still now unfolding. The Coral Canal itself in Thailand is back on the table, but many of the projects, Guadar Port and so forth, these are projects that were identified then by LaRouche and his team. And these circulated, as Sergei Glaziev indicates, internationally. These were not pie-in-the-sky meanderings. Move on to the next. Operation Juarez, produced by LaRouche in the context of his work with China. This was all in the context...
Mexico.
I'm sorry?
Mexico.
Mexico, what did I say?
China.
China. A little bit of a difference there. Mexico. Although Mexico-China collaboration is very important today. We'll try to tie all the pieces together here. Operation Juarez, named after Benito Juarez, the great president of Mexico. This was at the time of LaRouche's collaboration with President Lopez Portillo of Mexico. At the same time, LaRouche was continuing as an advisor to the Reagan administration and was organizing for a shift in U.S. policy towards development of the Americas. Continue on to the next. And here is another report that came out by the Scheller Institute itself on the integration of Ibero-America, the economies. The same kind of integration that is being organized for today by a number of leaders throughout the region. Continue to the next. And of course, here closer to home, but also globally, LaRouche was organizing for a new Bretton Woods. This conference was actually held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. And the former foreign minister of Guyana, Fred Wills, is to our right there. Helga Zepp-LaRouche to his left. That conference was in the, I believe, 1988.
And that banner was by Joe Jennings.
Thank you. Continuing to the next. Continuing on, Mike. Yeah, thank you. Here is a follow-up report, proceedings of a number of conferences and documents prepared out of collaboration between LaRouche and his team with leaders in Africa on African economic development. Again, these received not just wide circulation, but have become influential documents for what is now occurring on that continent and among those nations. Continuing on to the next. This was in the context of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the initiation of the so-called productive triangle, utilizing the Bonn, Vienna, Paris triangle of concentrated industrial and scientific capability to throw off a series of, you see them, arrows going in 4 different directions of economic development into the south of Italy, into the Mezzogiorno, into the Iberian Peninsula, north, and also all the way to the Arctic, and also east across to the integration of the economies of Eastern Europe and Russia. An economic development program where the capabilities of the triangle would spin off the kind of exports of capital goods needed to revive those nations. Continue on to the next, and that became the Eurasian Rail Project, and continuing on. This became the Eurasian Land Bridge, the New Silk Road, as here presented in 1997, which became in turn, in many ways, directly the conceptual basis for the Belt and Road Initiative of China today, as not just a China project, but a project among many, many nations. Continuing on to the next. And here is a photograph of Mr. LaRouche and Mrs. LaRouche there with Sergei Glaziev in Moscow. Mr. LaRouche is the gentleman with his hand to his head there, but you get the idea. This is the kind of ongoing effort in which Mr. LaRouche was engaged. Continuing, and the economics of the noosphere. This was came out of a conference in the context of the works of Vernadsky and a conference on Vernadsky in Russia that LaRouche authored. Continuing, still influential, and Earth's Next 50 Years, where LaRouche spells out the shift to Asia, to Eurasia, as a center for the future of mankind's development, as a driver for all of mankind's development. So that's a brief summary. And from there, let's go to Italy. I think that's the next slide. This last week saw, on I believe it was on Thursday, conference in Milan, hosted jointly by the government of Lombardy, of the Lombardy region, and Movasol, which is the party, LaRouche movement party in Italy. Speaking at this conference, there you can go to the next slide. On your left is Michele Garacci, the Undersecretary of State for the Italian Ministry of Economic Development, who is also the head of Task Force China for the Italian government. And he's there presenting on the outlines of what will be the content of the Memorandum of Understanding, which Italy will be signing most likely with China this coming week when President Xi Jinping visits Italy March 22nd and 23rd. To Mr. Garacci's left, our right, is one of our leading members in Italy, and actually also out of Germany, who spearheaded the Transaqua project. Let's move on to the next slide. And there is Helga Zepp-LaRouche there with the translator, with Dorini, who is the head of the Movasol movement in Italy, translating for Helga Zepp-LaRouche. What we're going to, now, let me just mention here, and then we're going to move to a short video, about a 16-minute video. At the same time that this conference is occurring, with Mr. Garacci obviously very much present in Milan, the major industrial center of Italy, Giulio Tremonti was interviewed, the former economics minister of, or finance minister, if you will, of Italy. Giulio Tremonti was interviewed in Corriere della Sera, one of the leading newspapers of record in Italy, on the potentials of the Belt and Road, which he fully endorsed and supported. But he continued, he said, it is a project that dates back to the mid-1990s of the American visionary Lyndon LaRouche, who saw it as the salvation of humanity. I'll repeat, this is Giulio Tremonti, also a friend of Mr. LaRouche's and Helga Zepp-LaRouche's, in Corriere della Sera just this last week. It is a project, the Belt and Road Initiative, is a project that dates back to the mid-1990s of the American visionary Lyndon LaRouche, who saw it as the salvation of humanity. So with that, let's, as background and context, and by the way, Helga Zepp-LaRouche has made the point that our conference in Milan was planned months before. It was a coincidence that it occurred in the context of President Xi Jinping's upcoming visit. But nonetheless, it's certainly indicates the actual process which had been involved in bringing this meeting of minds about. Italy, if it is assumed, will sign this memorandum of understanding, which will make Italy part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which already encompasses 112 nations. This is what the neocons, Pompeo, Bolton, and company, are railing against. This is what the Western media has been railing against. Helga will speak to that. So let's go to Helga Zepp-LaRouche. This is her remarks to the conference. It's been edited to take out the translation part so that it'll flow in English, and Mike's setting it up right now. Oh, Mike's having some problems. Well, Mike's having some problems there. Any questions so far in terms of what I've presented? Otherwise, we could perhaps go ahead. Yes, sir.
You're saying the 110 countries are committed to the Belt and Road.
Right. They've either signed memorandums of understanding or have other, agreements, official agreements.
Canal is going to be dug in Thailand. I thought it's going to be dug in Singapore or in that peninsula to make it.
No, it's on the Kra Peninsula, which is part of Thailand. You're referring to the Kra Canal that I mentioned earlier. It's one of the projects.
Kra Canal or
Kra, K-R-A. Kra Canal.
Is it in south of Thailand?
Yes, on the peninsula, coming down, from what you would consider Thailand proper, geographically, down, yes, to the south. Into Malaysia would be, basically the other end. But the Kra Canal would be built in
how much
Thailand.
it will shorten the sea route from, say, Shanghai is the port or Guangzhou?
Well,
Canton is the port.
you're asking. The question is how much would the Kra Canal shorten the length of travel? And I would be speaking off the top of my head to give some number, but it would be a very, very significant reduction. But more importantly, or just as importantly, was that it would relieve the pressure, on the sea lanes through that area around Singapore and so forth, through the Straits of Malacca, would relieve those pressures, reduce the problems of piracy and so forth, and therefore it would solve what is now a major strategic choke point in international sea traffic. Belinda, did you have something to add on that?
I was just going to say the map is right behind you. Maybe you can just show them where you're talking about.
Oh, well, yeah, it's right here.
About the light.
Yeah, well, Mike's busy working on something else. Well, here's Thailand in green, if you can see it, and then and Thailand comes all the way down here, and then Malaysia's down here at the tip. But the Kra Canal would be about across this narrow isthmus here,
And Thailand
narrow part of the
has
isthmus.
agreed to build the canal?
What? No. This is now under discussion between China and the Thai government. It's been under discussion for decades. It's now under fresh discussion, and at last I recall, the government of Thailand, I don't want to misspeak, but the government of Thailand, the King of Thailand, have agreed that they want to proceed with planning for the canal. So it's been revived. There's committees, there's businesses and so forth promoting the idea. So this would be a new project that would certainly contribute to interconnectivity. Yeah.
One last question. Whatever happened to that canal that was being built in Nicaragua?
It's
Is it still going on?
It's frozen right now. It was a private program to begin with, private Chinese companies. For a number of reasons, it's on hold at the moment. It may still proceed.
Okay,
Yes.
Brian, you want to try it now?
Oh,
Did you want to go ahead, Joanne, or do you want?
I was just going to ask, are the people that live in that region are going to be the ones they're going to employ? And then what about industrial pollution? Have they certain groups worked out if they're going to be doing all?
Oh,
this
sure.
building?
No, I mean, projects in every country are different, but and I couldn't speak for the Kra Canal. There isn't even an agreement on the specifics of it yet. But the countries involved all are interested in employing local labor and using these projects. The whole idea of these projects, including on the part of China, is to upgrade the local labor force. If you're upgrading the local labor force, they're going to be more employable, they're going to be more productive, it's going to generate more wealth, and that country then it's going to be a market for future imports, including from China in the future. In other words, China's own self-interest is in promoting the development of these countries. The irony here is this was the traditional American approach in terms of foreign policy historically. You know, if you go back to as far as John Quincy Adams, but you come forward at least as far forward as Franklin Roosevelt and the Good Neighbor policy, the whole idea was to develop countries such as in South America, to develop them, you know, to help them build infrastructure and so on, so they would become, you know, vital partners in the future. You know, win-win, right? All China has done is to adopt the American system model. You know, obviously they call it something else. They're calling it the Belt and Road. You know, you could call it whatever you want to call it. That's their choice of terms. But the concept overall, in terms of the fundamental physical economy, to get back to LaRouche's concept of physical economics, is to develop the creativity of your populations. And once you do that, you're, you know, the genie's out of the bottle.
Well, you know, like how they always project Africa, all the big people or the royal people get all the money, and the other people, the little people, don't get anything.
Well, this is the heritage of colonialism and the oil multinationals.
Yeah.
This is what's being busted up by these great projects that China is working in collaboration with these nations to develop. None of these other the oil companies, the colonial occupiers, never developed infrastructure in these countries, except for build a narrow gauge railway to haul out the loot. What's being done now is completely the opposite. And again, it's not something that China is doing simply because it makes them feel good. They know that it's going to be beneficial for everyone in the future, including themselves. A more secure world. Mm-hmm.
And Brian, just before we get started there, I think it's really important in answer to your question, what Helga's always stressing, as she did last night, which is that, you know, the most widely read economist in China for decades now has been Friedrich List, who is the author of the book, The American System of Economics. I mean, the American System of Political Economy. I don't remember the title. American System of Political Economy. He was an American system economist. And, you know, that's what they've studied, and they've studied LaRouche. And they've put this into practice now.
Okay, so let's go on to Helga. She's going to cover some of the same ground. This is from just 2 days ago in Milan, Italy, and so.
And then proceeded to make treaties with, in the meantime, I think it's 112 countries, an enormous growth, developed 6 major industrial corridors. The Belt and Road Initiative became very quickly the largest infrastructure project in history ever. And the strange thing was that for about 4 years in the mainstream media in the United States and in Europe, there was practically no reporting about this. And then all of a sudden, in a obviously coordinated way, the major think tanks of Europe and the United States started a series of attacks, studies that China is causing countries to fall into the debt trap, that it's just an effort to replace the United States as the dominant force in the world, to become Chinese imperialist, that, you know, the Belt and Road projects are not viable, that China is an authoritarian system, that Xi Jinping is a dictator. So all of a sudden you had a barrage of attacks on this concept. The funny thing is that if you would ask and listen to the leaders of the countries cooperating with the Belt and Road on the other side, like the Africans, the Asian countries, the Latin American countries, they would be full of praise and say that with the Chinese cooperation, they have for the first time the opportunity to overcome the underdevelopment and poverty they had suffered as a result of 500 years of Western colonialism and 70 years of IMF conditionalities, which prevented them from exactly having that kind of development. And they were full of praise, calling China a friend. So you get a completely opposite view. I have come to the conclusion that everything the Western media, the mainstream media, are saying about China is fake news, and just a lie. And it comes from the fact that many people in the West simply have lost the ability to imagine that any country, leave alone China, could promote something which is indeed for the common good of all of humanity. When Xi Jinping talks about the shared community for the common future of mankind, or community of destiny, he means it. And isn't it obvious that in the time of thermonuclear weapons, of international space travel, of conquering all the problems of the world, that we have to think about the one humanity first before we talk about national interest? As a matter of fact, the conception of a win-win cooperation for the Belt and Road Initiative, it has all the economic aspects which are beneficial to all the countries who have participated. But it is much more than that, because from the standpoint of the evolution of mankind, if you take a step back and don't look at the conflict between Marseille and Trieste, which I understand is obviously very important for the Italians, but if you look at the larger point of view, isn't it natural that infrastructure development would eventually open up all continents and connect them? So now all of a sudden you have this eruption of anti-China propaganda, but it comes from the fact that we are now at a point where something happens which happened already 16 times in history, namely that the up to now dominant power is being bypassed by the up to now second largest power. And in history, this led 12 times to war between those two competing powers, and 4 times it was just that the second power bypassed the dominant power without war. China has emphasized many times they don't want, obviously, the 12 to follow the 12 examples where this conflict would lead to war, but they also do not want to simply replace the United States in the role of the leader of an unipolar world, but they want to build a completely new system of international relations based on sovereignty, on respect for the different social system, on non-interference, actually proposing a completely new international system of international relations. So the big question strategically is you have the conflict between the United States and Russia, which is obvious because of the cancellation of the ABM treaty, then the Russian reaction to that, now the cancellation of the INF treaty. So there are many people who think that we are actually close in a worse strategic crisis than during the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the relation of the United States and Russia. But, if you talk to some strategic insiders on both sides of the Atlantic, they easily admit that the much more dangerous conflict is actually the one between the United States and China. Will the United States accept the rise of Asia? And, the Belt and Road Initiative is just the obvious expression of that. Or is that which was said by the Rand Corporation a couple of months ago, that it's better to have the war with China now than in 10 years from now because the casualties will be less? Well, obviously, this is something we have to change, and I think that the best way to change it is indeed, to bring in this reality of a new paradigm of thinking altogether. We have to leave geopolitics. We have to leave the idea that there can be a legitimate interest of one country or a group of countries against another block of countries, because this was what led 2 times to World War in the 20th century. As a matter of fact, I think the potential to overcome this conflict is absolutely there. I know in Europe many people are fainting when you mention the name of President Trump, but President Trump is not seeking confrontation with Russia. As a matter of fact, he wants to have an improved relation with Russia, which he proved in the summit with Putin in Helsinki. And despite the present trade tensions, President Trump always talks about President Xi Jinping as his very good friend. and China being a great country, and that he wants to actually have a good relationship between the United States and China. So the attacks on Italy coming from the White House, the Financial Times mentioned this Garrett Marcus, is not representing the same view as Trump. It comes from a faction of the neocons, which are unfortunately also in the Trump administration. But the factual situation in the United States is very divided. You have the Democrats and the neocons trying to get Trump out of office with Russiagate. But, on the other side, I think President Trump has proven a tremendous sustainability against the efforts to drive him out of office. And his supporters are absolutely backing him, and the chances that there will be a second Trump administration are actually very, very high. Now, one of the accusations against China and the Belt and Road Initiative is that it would divide Europe. Now, I think everybody knows Europe is divided already without China. You have the North-South conflict because of the EU austerity policy, which impoverished Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, did not give development to the East European countries. So they are now happy to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative because the EU did not provide these things. Now, the second area of division is obviously the migrant issue, where you have the division between East and West. The East European countries do not want to have any part of the proposed quota system of the EU. Now, what Italy is actually doing in this context is really a role model, because the kind of cooperation between Italian firms and Chinese firms in the development of Africa is actually the only human way to address the refugee question. So you have right now 13 countries who already signed the MOU with China. You have now with Italy the first G7 country, which is really overrated because the G7 is no longer that important as compared to the G20, for example. And you have many ports. Mr. Geraci said it's actually all the ports of Europe who are already wanting to be a hub between not only the new Silk Road over the land route, but also hubs to the maritime Silk Road, Portugal and Spain becoming the hub for all the Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries around the world. So there is a complete changed attitude developing very quickly. There are also, even in Germany and France, the two countries which are now trying to put the brakes on the most, apart from the EU Commission, there are many cities who are absolutely recognizing their self-interest to cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. You have 3 states in Germany, Schleswig-Holstein, Bavaria, and Brandenburg, who all the time have huge delegations back and forth. You have many cities where the mayors are complete fans of the cooperation with China, and it is an increasing dynamic, which is more rapidly than you would think. So if you would ask my prognosis, I think the perspective of unifying Europe, not necessarily under an EU bureaucracy, but in the conception of de Gaulle, more like a Europe of the fatherlands, uniting with China, with Russia, with the Belt and Road Initiative, the Eurasian Economic Union, and European countries to cooperate fully in this new paradigm is absolutely there. Well, I think that is also the only way to how Europe can impact this strategic situation. Because if you had a united Europe of the fatherlands cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative, including Germany and France, that would be the best way to get the United States to also give up their opposition, which I said, is not Trump himself, but these other forces, and get the United States to join the new paradigm. And I think this is the only hope we have to avoid a catastrophe, where we would end in World War III with nuclear weapons, meaning the extinction of civilization. So in that sense, what Italy is doing right now is of the greatest historical importance, because Italy with what you are doing, with the MOU, but also with the joint ventures with China in Africa, can become the role model for all the other European countries. But the new Silk Road is not just an economic concept. Obviously, infrastructure, investment, all of this is extremely important as the backbone, but it has a much more and not so known cultural, moral dimension, which I think is best expressed in the fact that the Chinese thinking is actually based on the Confucian theory, namely that you absolutely must have harmony among all the nations, developing all in a harmonious way. And you know, when some think tanks say that there is now a competition of systems between the Western liberal model and the state-guided model of the Chinese state economy, well, what they really mean is that, you know, China has developed its whole policy based on the Confucian orientation, which means that the state is also in charge of the moral improvement of its population through the aesthetical education. As a matter of fact, Xi Jinping has said repeatedly that he puts the highest emphasis on the aesthetical education because the result of this is the beauty of the mind and the beauty of the soul.
Quando i vari centri studi e pensatori parlano di competizione di sistemi, dimenticano il fatto che la Cina ha sviluppato una politica basata su Confucio e il fatto che lo Stato sia responsabile anche dello sviluppo morale ed estetico e dell'educazione estetica della popolazione. E questa è una garanzia.
The goal is the beauty of the mind.
E che l'obiettivo di tutta questa politica sia la bellezza della mente.
You see, I understand Italian.
Capisco l'italiano, almeno quello che manca.
So the problem is, the reason why some people in the West regard that as a competition is because the Western liberal, neoliberal and liberal philosophy has moved away from that conception. We are no longer humanists. We are no longer thinking like during the Italian Renaissance or the German classical period, but we have replaced that with a liberal thinking of everything is allowed. Every degenerate form of culture is allowed. Everything goes. You know, I don't want to elaborate that, but if you look at the violence, the pornography in the entertainment, you know, we don't have to worry. We will lose that competition of the systems simply because we are not taking care of our future generations, but allowing them to morally completely decay. And that is why, you know, I think that we have to understand that the only way how Europe can persist in the coming future is not through military power. What Mr. Macron is proposing is ridiculous. But we will preserve our European culture only if we return to the greatest tradition of our own history, meaning reviving the spirit and the ideas and principles of the Italian Renaissance, of the École Polytechnique in France, of the German classical music, literature, poetry. Only if we rise again to our best traditions can we persist in the coming world. So I think that the cultural dimension of the new Silk Road is as important, if not more important, than the question of economics.
So sorry that was a little jumpy, but as I said, Liliana Giorini's translation was taken out of it until just the very end. So I think that was very informative, very, you know, filled in a much broader picture. So with that, and thinking about that, move to the next slide. We're going to shift gears here.
Okay, hold on.
Okay, we're waiting for Mike to... Mike's got to shift from video to pictorial, or whatever they call it, to slides.
Got a slide
we're going to slide into the slides, Joel says. Okay. All right.
Okay, here you go.
All right.
Mm.
Okay.
Got the light on?
Yeah. All right. Now, where do you think that is? Some of you already know.
Yeah.
You can't give it away. Well, this is Stafford, Texas.
Oh.
This is the HCC Advanced Manufacturing and Training Center at HCC Stafford. A huge new facility, something like, I don't remember the square footage, but it's a very large standalone complex. And where HCC is providing training in advanced machine tool use. These are numerically controlled machine tools here, CNC machine tools. They're to train engineers. Engineers not in the sense of four-year degrees, but engineers in terms of engineering technicians, I guess you could use the term, that will be operating these machines in the machine tool companies in the greater Houston area and beyond. Move on to you can just move through these fairly rapidly. This is the manufacturing lab itself. Moving on, this is, people get used to thinking all we do is shuffle paper, and that's not what, we either import it or we got to produce it. And I think most people realize we have to begin producing more ourselves. And productivity is very good as an element of culture as well. Here, go back to that one just a second. Those are manual machine tools. A couple of the teachers there, among all of this equipment, which is used by the students. You can see it's state of the art. It's a brand new equipment. It's not your granddaddy's machine shop, right? Move on to the next. Another picture of those CNC machine tools. Go on to the next. Each one can, would be making its own. Would be put to its own use. Just one of the logo of the facility. This is just fun. This was on display there. This was an open house that I attended. This is a device. I don't know, roughly. It's a little bit distorted in this picture, but I'd say roughly 5 inches by 5 inches by 5 inches. And this was not carved. People think of, if you and it's not assembled.
3D printer.
This is additive manufacturing, or what the more common day-to-day term is 3D. But I think that really confuses people. They think of just plastics and silly things and so on. This is a metal made out of metal, and this was built up layer after layer of layer, based on digital programming, right, of the entire piece from as a totality. And built up from bottom to top. Just fun to consider and think about. It may be some kind of carburetor type device, something like that. I mean, not that it's a carburetor per se, but something like that. Go on to the next. They have a separate fab lab, fabrications laboratory. Anyone can come in the lab. This is the head of the lab there. And you can note here on the table, he's got the space shuttle. He's got other devices. You can't quite see it. There's also a scramjet there, but you can't quite see it at this. Well, actually, it's sticking up here. This is the scramjet model. Anyway, he's a buff, NASA buff, and he has a. But people can come in there. Anyone can come in there with an actual worked out design, and they'll help build a prototype. They won't, you come in there with some crazy idea in your head. They're not going to do, they're going to turn that crazy idea into something. You have to actually design it, put it into a workable design. But then they'll help you get the bugs out of it and so forth and help you produce it. You don't have to be a student there. Go on to the next. This is part of that same fab labs. It's just some of the equipment, manual machines, numerically controlled machine tools, other equipment, programming. They do it all. They do programming. They teach programming, prototype design, prototype building. Obviously, working in a machine tool plant. What this involves, the different kinds of machines you have to know how to operate. All of that is they're trained there. You can move on to the next. Just a close up of one of some more of this equipment. This is part of the fab lab, fabrications laboratory. Move on. And goes right to the heart of Lynn's economy. We went around the world in terms of projects of Lynn's around the world. This was, put out, more than 10 years ago, but as the cover of one of our LaRouche Pack pamphlets. But it goes to very much the heart of what needs to be accomplished today. Hopefully, building out of the outcomes of the trade agreement between China and the United States, among other initiatives. But this is now moving on to the next. And I'm just going to conclude here very briefly. An initiative that we're engaged in right now is to promote the formation of the President's Commission on Climate Security. About a week and a half ago, the Washington Post and other press leaked the preparations of a document by the National Security Council to create a Presidential Commission on Climate Security. And in that document, at least as leaked, whether it's the final form or otherwise, it states that as regarding the issue of climate change, global warming, and so on and so forth, these scientific and national security judgments have not undergone a rigorous, independent, and adversarial scientific peer review to examine the certainties and uncertainties of climate science, as well as implications for national security. In other words, if the global warming, doomsayers are right, well, that's one thing. If they're wrong, what are the costs? And that this has to be subject to an adversarial scientific peer review, all out on the table, for the American people to see. And we strongly believe this is necessary. It's being promoted. Dr. William Happer is being promoted, of Princeton, is being promoted to head it. He's extremely well-versed. He's the former head of the Department of Energy's Office of Science, which provides the largest funding to science projects in the country. He formerly headed it. And he's written hundreds of papers and so forth, wide range of documents, and he is a member of the National Security Council. So he's being promoted to head this commission. Now, what does this have to do with what we've been presenting here? Well, what Helga developed in her remarks there in Milan, what Lynn's work was about, is still about over decades, is about economic development. And in fact, ironically, this is the outcomes, at least the schematic of the outcomes of that development, those development initiatives in some sense. This is the NASA findings that as opposed to the Earth dying, that the planet is growing, that we have increased flora, and you can assume fauna with it. The areas marked in red circles are the areas of greatest development, and the most concentrated growth of greenery is in India and in China. This came out in early February, these NASA findings. You can move to the next slide. This is China, and highlighting the areas of the most rapid greening of China, which is about the size of the United States, to give you an idea. And you see the population-dense regions in the south, they're increasing in terms of plant growth. And you also see, I'd point you also up to the northeast, where there's been an extensive effort at reforestation as well, to deal with sandstorms, which have been a problem over millennia, to begin reversing that process. China has planted over 30 billion trees since the 1990s, and they are continuing to plant in a very just ongoing, committed way, looking to the future of their country. And the development of areas that are now currently uninhabited or inhabited at very low population densities, to build new cities and so forth, to develop their nation. As against the idea, we're dealing here with an onslaught not simply from the neocons in terms of the drive for war and the imposition of unilateralist policies against the interests of other nations, but we're also dealing with a Trojan horse, if you will, of the so-called environmental movement, which now is demanding. People know about Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal. You've probably heard about it, and the desire in the Green New Deal to reduce U.S. production of CO2 down to zero by 2050 or sooner. That's a moving target. They'd like to make it sooner. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I think it is important that we bring it into light, and we're encouraging calls into the White House. Now, we're encouraging people to call the White House, encourage President Trump to go ahead with the President's Commission on Climate Security, that this needs to be instituted. We need this review. We need to be able to assess. Move on to the next slide, if you can. Move to the next slide. Move to the next slide. Move to the next slide. Science is not fashion. Okay? The whole idea that science has been decided on the basis of a consensus. You have this group of 58 self-described, quote, senior military and national security leaders who state that less than 0.2% of peer-reviewed climate science papers dispute the facts of global warming, and the potentially catastrophic effects, and therefore the necessity of slashing CO2 production on Earth. As Einstein, among others, emphasized, it only takes one scientist to disprove another scientist. The point is, it has to be based on science, not on the basis of consensus. It's not a matter. Further, as Jason Ross points out, we have a leaflet out there. People can take it with you and make copies of it and circulate it. It's a very thorough review of this in a brief overview. Most of this is there is no grouping of scientists that's been cataloged, out of which you could say 0.2% dispute the facts. There's no data. This is completely made up. It's just a phony figure made up out of thin air. It's part of this bludgeoning of the American people, to try to bludgeon the American people into line on this. And just as they attempted to bludgeon LaRouche, it didn't work, but nonetheless. And we've got to roll all of this back. It's the same thing as the attempt to force Trump through a coup out of office as the elected president of the United States. The American people have to stand up and break with what Helga was discussing in terms of the culture, the liberal culture where anything goes. We've got to return to a science based on classical principles of beauty and the principles of scientific discovery, and once again producing creative people. Move on to the next slide. Again, another example of passing fashion. Let's move on. Move on, Mike. This is Dr. William Happer. And move on to the next. And I think that's the statement from LaRouche Pack, the title of it. And again, you can get that statement out at the front door. So I think maybe I'll just stop there. If there's a few questions on climate, we can answer those. Climate change and so-called. But I think this is a good stopping point. We've covered a lot of ground. Thank you for your attention.
What do you think about the young people that are protesting every Friday about the climate situation?
I think it is right. I think it is right to call it child abuse. These are young people who don't know anything about science. They've simply been told certain things in school,
And terrorized.
by the mass media, right? And so they're being abused because they're being led around by their nose. And what they're doing is self-destructive in the sense they're promoting something that's against their own interests. But it's even more fundamental. It's reinforcing in them the idea that their judgments can be based on something as facile as the latest fashion, as the latest thing that they're told, as the latest thing that's popular. So, okay, it's popular to go out and take Friday off from school. Where have I heard that before? It's always been popular to take time off from school, particularly on a Friday, you know. What's really going on here? This is adults manipulating children. This is like the children's crusade out of the Dark Ages. I mean, to the extent that this actually catches on. So we really have a responsibility to educate their parents, you know, to stop this sort of nonsense. Again, this is why we need the President's Commission on Climate Security. We need a full airing of these issues, you know, in a debate, if you will, as a public debate, so people can actually assess this, including children. You know, if we judo it, we can use this as a way to open up for children the world of science. How do you actually study what is going on in the troposphere versus the stratosphere? What is, you know, the process of the sun's rays, you know, this radiation coming into the earth? What is so-called, you know, what is CO2? You know, CO2 is what plants eat. You know, here suddenly we're acting as if CO2 is evil, when plants live on it, and then plants produce oxygen for us. So what's this evil CO2? Is it really so evil? Anyway, I'm just saying, we could really begin opening up a different kind of discussion in the country in a broader sense.
The demonstration in Denver had to be canceled due to a blizzard.
Is that true, or is that actually true?
Well, yeah, they had about a foot of snow.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think it's important
There goes
to
global warming.
add to that picture that you just painted, you know, the self-image that children have as a result of this brainwashing they're getting in school.
Well, maybe they can get their way brought into school, like all these rich people are buying their kids these, the situation with the universities and getting college entry. You know, you gotta get good people that's gonna teach, not these people that are out here being, you know, not using good integrity.
Mark?
And so who's teaching whom? That's the whole thing. You got, you gotta clean up the schools to put decent people in there to teach these kids the right way.
That's very true, because history's shown that you know, this is very innocent compared to some similar things that have happened in history regarding young people and their youthful enthusiasm. Because the Red Guards in China during the Cultural Revolution, the witch burning times, when children would denounce their parents because, you know, they were led to believe that they were actually doing something good by that. So this is a very scary thing. But the silver lining to that is that if we can turn that around and get these kids motivated to believe what is true and what is beautiful, we can turn that magnificent energy into a productive channel. You know,
Right. I think Diane was touching on something very important in that regard. I mean, if you're teaching children that their lives are useless because human beings are a burden on the planet, and that the Earth would be that much better without them, and of course without their parents and without their neighbors. I mean, you really, I mean, you're
creating genocidal.
Yeah, you're back to Jonestown, you know, but on a national scale. You know, people are drinking the Kool-Aid. No, it's really destructive. But I agree with Mark. You know, on the other hand, that spark, like these students.
But
You know, like I was at HCC. I mean, you think of the HCC. Here's Houston Community College. We don't even think about it. I mean, most people don't think about it. You know, it's got over 50,000 students. Upwards of 70,000 students go there at any one time, on 20 different campuses. Yeah. They're turning out nurses. They're turning out machinists. They're turning out all kinds of people. Also, a lot of people go there for, you know, for their first 2 years to save on college tuition, and they can live at home and work at the same time they're going to school and all that, right? Trying to make, but you know, it's you know, it's an enormous resource, and you could expand that kind of facility all over the country to meet the needs, training up, you know, young people. For a productive future, building, you know, the new cities, the new infrastructure, and so on that we need.
MIT started out as a similar institution back when it was founded.
All right.
Just to say.
Oh, that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask, do you know how the funding for this enormous new institution, how that works?
Well, the Stafford Center there for advanced manufacturing. Well, it was put together with the private sector. Stafford is more or less the geographic center of the machine shop industry in Greater Houston, which is huge. Yeah. I mean, it's over 10,000. There's over 10,000 manufacturing facilities in Houston, and the single largest component of that is for the oil and petrochemical industries. And the largest part of that is valves, which have to be machined. You know, whether it's metal, sometimes now it's plastic, the other materials, but they've got to be machined. And so they need machinists. They need qualified machinists, and qualified machinists don't walk in the door. They've got to be trained somewhere. So that was the background for putting together the center. But the HCC was set up in 1971 through a public referendum, you know, in Houston. I'm not sure if it was Harris County wide, but certainly Houston. Harris County was a referendum in Harris County. Anyway, set up in 1971, and so it's grown since then. And there's obviously huge demand, and they keep growing because of the tuition fees they collect and so on and so forth. And I don't know about gifts and so on. I'm sure they've received gifts, contributions, and so forth otherwise, but primarily, this is just an outgrowth of their normal work. Yeah.
Well, good. I'm glad to see it's not always about computers. I was looking at something today about that artificial intelligence or whatever that is, where they want, you know how you go in and you can scan your own groceries at Walmart and all that. I don't like that. I like people to scan it if I want to pay my money. But you know, I'm glad they're looking at other things, going back to the old school method of bringing in jobs and creation, because a lot of people don't want to do tech stuff all the time. I come from, you know, the Northeast, and everything was industrial, and I'm glad they're kind of bringing that back.
They need it. Yeah, we need it.
I was telling somebody the other day, if it wasn't on the microwave or in that digital kind of thing, kids don't even know how to tell time on a clock. I'm saying, what's going on? You know,
Big hand.
you know, they don't. You know, they don't. My son didn't even know what the mailbox was. I said, it's the blue thing that's red, white, and blue, and it got an eagle on it. And it says U.S. Post.
You probably thought it was mailbox and
email and all that. You know, everything is outdated to him. You put a letter in there.
What's a letter?
All right. So on to the moon and Mars. On to the moon and Mars. You know. Let's.
I'm glad to see it's going to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Brian.
Good. Thank you. Yep. Ready.